Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started right on time today, just because we have a lot of stuff to cover because we're kind of trying to catch you guys up. Um, didn't expect it to take so long to go over the syllabus on Monday, but we're gonna be playing catch up a little bit today. But that's all right. You guys might like it because it's gonna be a lot of me talking and not you guys doing much but listening. But yeah. So yesterday we started to go over today's topic. We finished discussing and answering the question of what is art. And today we are going over the purposes and functions of art. We did a little Padlet as an exit ticket activity yesterday, asking the question of what is a purpose or function of art. I'm going to call on someone in a second to share what they answered. If you don't remember, that's okay. But yeah, so I'll give you guys a second to try and remember what you wrote yesterday on what is the purpose or function of art. Derek, do you remember what you wrote yesterday?
It was a form of the artist expressing human creativity.
Yes, that is one. Thank you, Derek. So Derek just mentioned one, and the one that I think most of you wrote as your answer is expression or self-expression. What is one of the 6 purposes or functions of art? So you are correct.
One of the 6 functions I found was delight.
Yes. And that is the one we're going to be starting with today, is art for delight. Art for delight basically just refers to things that are aesthetically pleasing to the eye. And we're going to spend a lot of time discussing what is aesthetically pleasing today, because that is a large genre of things. Like yesterday, you guys did a really good job of letting me know when the presentation wasn't working. So thank you for doing that. And if it happens today for some reason whatsoever at all, please let me know because I won't know. So yeah, just let me know if that happens. Let me know if you have a question because I can't see what's going on in the chat. So just go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind, especially since I can't tell if you guys have questions. So knowing that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I apologize today because it is going to be a lot of me talking. And I hate listening to myself talk a lot. Jess and I talked the other day, and she was saying she's really shy. And I'm like, you have no idea. I hate talking. So today is not going to be one of my favorite days because I don't like talking. But in order to get us caught up so that you have all the information that you need for your quiz tomorrow, I'm going to try and go through this as quickly as possible. But like I said, if you have a question, please stop me and ask it. But most of today is pretty easy to grasp. There are 6 purposes and functions of art overall. However, those purposes and functions are interchangeable. So just because there's an example under one category doesn't mean it's only in that one category. It can fall under other categories as well. And I'll talk about that later when we start looking at specific artworks. But we're going to start off today going over vocabulary, specifically these 2 terms that relate to art as delight, which thank you again, Jess, for pointing that out. That is our first purpose and function of creating art, is for aesthetic beauty and enjoyment by the viewer and the artist themselves. So aesthetics just refers to the term of awareness of beauty. people's aesthetics and definition of beauty change over time with trends and history. They also change through cultures. And every single person has a different opinion on what they think is beautiful versus what other people think is beautiful. The fashion industry is a great example of changing beauty standards. So, for example, in the early 2000s, the typical ideal female figure was extremely skinny, to the point of being anorexic. And then towards the end of the 2000s, it was more aesthetically pleasing for women to have curves. And today we see people that do plastic surgery and things like Photoshop to be their ideal version of themselves, which leads us into that second term, idealism. Idealism is representing a person or a thing in its most ideal or perfect form. Typically, this is not realistic, but idealistic. So I just mentioned Photoshop. If you're in tune at all with society, you're familiar with the Instagram models and Instabaddies that go and Photoshop their pictures and images like crazy. It's not realistic, but idealistic. It is the idealistic form of what they consider aesthetically beautiful. So those are just really good examples of those vocabulary words. And those two particular vocabulary words are going to apply to our first purpose of art, which is for delight or viewer enjoyment, is what my last class said. So once again, we are going to be going over the purposes and functions of art. Those purposes and functions of art are art for delight, art for commemoration, art as commentary, art for persuasion, art in worship, and art as self-expression. Most of you, and what Derek was hinting at yesterday, picked this one. And that is an example of a purpose or function of art. And like I mentioned a second ago, just because there's 6 categories doesn't mean that one artwork or artist can't fall into several of those 6 categories. So those are interchangeable titles. They can fall under more than one category. We're going to start off with the easiest one, art is delight. And then we'll move into some of the more complex ones as we go. The most complex one being art for self-expression. But art for delight is really just enjoying beauty and decoration. Finding things aesthetically pleasing to the eye. It's an example of art for entertainment of the consumer. And once again, the definitions of beauty have changed throughout time. For example, the definition of beauty in classical Greece, or the idealized version of beauty in classical Greece for a man, would be something like this. The Greeks were really into showing idealized form. So they tended to sculpt and paint images of people in their 20s, because that's when you're at your peak of your beauty, I guess, according to them. The males were generally muscular figures, and the females had some softer, more curvy aspects to them. The Renaissance was a rebirth of those classical Greek idealized forms. So in Renaissance art for women, you would see a rebirth of that softer female figure as the form of idealized beauty. So both of these are examples of art for delight. However, like I mentioned a second ago, things can fall under multiple categories. So for example, our discus thrower is a great example of art for commemoration or art in remembrance of someone or something. This discus thrower, he got his statue made after winning a discus throwing contest in the Olympics. So he's commemorated. So not only was this made for aesthetically pleasing the viewer's eye, but it is also an example of art for commemoration. And this one is not only made for the enjoyment of the viewer, but it is also art in worship or ritual because it does harken back to mythology, which once was a religion. So that's just to hit it home that things can fall under more than one category. But we are focusing on art in delight right now. Once again, sometimes people consider different things beautiful. Right here, we have a painting by James Abbott McNeill Whistler. By the way, when I'm talking about artists, usually I just use their last name or their surname. It's a habit that you pick up in the art world. So if you're wondering why I usually just say their last name, it's because some of them have really long names and their last name's a lot shorter. Okay, so this is Whistler attempting to capture a firework in the form of a painting. Fireworks were just starting to become more common for middle-class viewers at this time in history. And Whistler thought that a firework was extremely beautiful and he wanted to try and paint it. So back here in the background, really far away, you see little yellow dots. That is the firework. So this is extremely monochromatic. Monochromatic just means that the painting was done in one color in various tones and values. So in this particular painting, you see a lot of blues and greens just done in different shades and values and hues. So one tone, basically. Whistler himself thought this was an extremely beautiful painting. He captured the beauty of a firework. However, the public did not agree with him. This was not well received. They did not like it. That's just because people consider different things beautiful. Beauty, the definition of it, varies across cultures, history, time, people themselves. And so because of that, we are going to see a lot of different examples of beauty. Sometimes beauty is just something that's extremely symmetrical. Sometimes people enjoy symmetry. Sometimes people enjoy patterns and find them pleasing. Sometimes people enjoy color schemes. For example, I don't usually like the color red, so it's not beautiful to me. But I enjoy the colors blue and green and the cooler tones. That's my personal preference. People enjoy different color schemes. So if I see a painting like this one that's all in blue and green, I actually do really like it because those are some of my favorite colors. But if this was all red and orange, I probably wouldn't like it. So yeah. And that takes us to this particular image. Here we have a geometric pattern on a bowl. Like I mentioned, some people find symmetry and patterns to be extremely pleasing and enjoyable to their eye. Things don't have to be super fancy all the time. This is an extremely symmetrical pattern. Or this one, which uses complementary colors from the color wheel, red and green. Complementary colors tend to be extremely pleasing to the eye. Now you're catching on why Christmas colors are red and green. It's because they're complementary. Or some more of a Roscoe, which by the way, that's a Roscoe. Here we have an extremely symmetrical car. This is actually a sculpture, not a photograph. He cut a car in half and then put it back together in an interesting way. If you are an OCD person, you find symmetry extremely pleasing. This one's a little bit easier to comprehend as far as contemporary art being for delight, and that's Keisut Guillaume's Dancing in Electric Blue. So this is a bunch of beads strung along wire, and it is a sculpture that is hanging from the ceiling using those really thin plastic looking threads that you can't really see. Since it's hanging from the ceiling, it does become subject to breezes and any doors opening and closing in a room, so it'll spin like a ballerina. Some people will find this extremely delightful and entertaining and pleasing to see. Any questions about art for delight? So just to get a sense of different people's opinions, just because there's some things that people enjoy and some things they don't. I'm going to call on someone and ask them a question. Ricardo, can you come on for a second?
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So that car that was cut in half, did you think that was beautiful?
Yes, because of it looks so nice, both sides being exactly the same.
They are identical, yes. Now let's call on someone else. Faith, can you come on?
Yes.
Did you like that car?
Yeah, I did, but I wasn't like, it like didn't like blow me away, you know?
Oh, I know. I'm with you there. I'm like, yeah, I like the symmetry, but it doesn't blow me away.
Yeah.
That's because we as people enjoy different things and we like different things. I myself prefer the ballerina to the car, but that's just me. I'm also a little bit more feminine than Ricardo, probably. So yeah, the chessboard and the limes I don't really enjoy, but that's my personal opinion. I enjoy the Whistler painting more. So different people enjoy different things in terms of beauty, and that's totally fine. Artists make things because they think it's pretty, or they think it's delightful, or they think it's entertaining. And then if the viewer enjoys it the same way, great. If they don't, oh well. Okay, moving on to our next form of art. It is art as commentary. I mentioned at the beginning that we're going to slowly get a little bit more complex as far as topics and grasping them as we go throughout this. Art as commentary is the idea or the need for the artist to communicate with the viewer. So the artists themselves in these works that we're about to look at are trying to communicate a story or a vision or an opinion to the viewer. The first image that we're going to look at is an image of the Napoleonic Wars. Does anyone know who Napoleon was and what he tried to do in Europe? This is open to anyone.
Wasn't he like a French prince or something and he tried to conquer all of Europe?
He wasn't a prince, so they beheaded the prince. So this is what happened right after the French Revolution. The French kind of copied America after our revolution. If you remember American Revolution history, the French were our allies. So after they helped us win our revolution, they decided that they were going to overthrow their monarchy. So they beheaded all of their monarchy, and they started from fresh, and they ended up electing Napoleon as their leader. Napoleon ended up becoming a dictator. If you know your governments, that means that one person is controlling the army and the government and everything. And like Derek mentioned, Napoleon tried to take over all of Europe. He was pretty successful at doing so until he tried to conquer Russia during wintertime. We should never try and conquer Russia during wintertime. Just not advised. Alexander the Great has tried it. Napoleon tried it. Hitler tried it. They all lost. So just, I mean, why would you want to invade a tundra during winter? I don't know. That makes no sense. And that's just a little side note of history. I didn't tell you guys this on the first day, but I used to teach history. So I am very into history. So you might get some little side history lessons every once in a while. So we're about to look at an image about the Napoleonic Wars. And we're going to look at an artist named Francisco Goya's take on the wars, specifically how they affected Spain. Napoleon did try to conquer Spain, and he succeeded during that phase. So, oops, wrong PowerPoint. We don't need that one. Go away. Shoot. Now it won't go away. Just exit. Do you guys see this?
Yes, ma'am.
Just checking because it did something weird for a second. All right, so we have the Disaster of War series from Goya that we're going to look at first, and that series of prints ends up culminating into one grand painting. So here are the prints. Like I said, there's a series of 82 of them that just depict the different scenes. So here you have a fire in the background, a man being pulled away from his wife and child. And this is the grand painting that ended up being the end result for that series. This painting is called the 3rd of May, 1808. It was actually painted in 1814, so several years later. And like I said, it's grand meaning large. It's really big for a painting of this particular content. Normally, paintings this large at this period of time would only be for religion or historical purposes. History being like not just 1808, but like Greek history or Roman history, so really old history. So it's unusual for this to be this large. But here we see Goya's commentary on the Napoleonic Wars coming to a head. So over here on this side, you see Napoleon's soldiers with their guns pointed at unarmed citizens. So Goya himself saw this occur on the night of the 3rd of May. He saw French soldiers going into people's homes and dragging them out of their homes and shooting them in the streets. And this is what he's illustrating. So he's making a commentary on the brutality of Napoleon's men and Napoleon's desire to conquer and control everything. So once again, we have all unarmed people. None of them are armed. You have blood spilt on the floor. And then we have one figure that is the main figure. Haley, can you point out to me which person in this image is the central figure?
The man in white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the man in white. It's always really easy to figure out the main character in this painting. That is because all of the lines right here are pointing right to him. Our eyes tend to follow lines, and I'm saying this because our next chapter is all about lines. So I'm giving you a little preview to that. Our eyes like to follow lines and patterns. So all of the lines point to this guy. Also, like you mentioned, he is wearing white. White tends to stand out in a dark background. You also see light hitting him versus the shadows in the background. The use of strong lights and darks is called chiaroscuro, which is a vocab term that you'll learn in chapter 3. Chiaroscuro, really, it just means strong lights and darks. Chiaro means light, scuro means dark. So right here we have our extreme light, and then everything else surrounding is a lot darker and full of shadows. Also, this man's pose is really important, specifically to the commentary side of things. If we could see this in person, it's really hard to see it in a picture, and I've never been able to find a clear picture of this one. But this man has what's called stigmata in his hands. Stigmata are holes, and he's also holding his arms up. What important figure in time and history has holes in his hands and is often seen depicting holding his arms up? This is for anyone.
Jesus.
Yeah. So Goya is trying to portray this man as Jesus, the symbol of Christianity, the symbol of good and light and innocence. So he's trying to really hit it home that these guys are innocent Christians, good Christian people. And over here you have the evil Napoleon forces shooting those innocent people. Yeah, and that was iconography there. We learned that word yesterday. Iconography is symbolism. Continuing on with art as commentary, we're going to skip forward. I'm going to skip the Bertrand Morisot one and move on to the Gustave Courbet image. Sometimes art as commentary is a really big statement, like Goya's painting. Sometimes it's not such a big deal. Sometimes it is just the artist trying to retell a story, which is what is happening here. Right here, we have an image of Gustave Courbet telling the story of his great uncle being buried. The fun thing about this is even if you didn't see the title saying Burial at Ornans, you could probably figure out that someone died and someone's being buried. That's because you see the priests and the religious images and figures over here. And then on the opposite side of the pane, you see everyone dressed in black and all of the women carrying handkerchiefs and crying. And then, of course, the most important symbol, you see the hole in the ground. So it's quite obvious that the story that's being told and conveyed right here in the commentary that Courbet is trying to show to his viewer is that his great uncle's burial had quite a bit of significance to him. If you notice the size of the image, it's another really large painting. Normally, a painting that is about a everyday subject like someone being buried would not be this big. It would be quite small. So that just also conveys the importance to Courbet of his great uncle's passing. So this is once again just the commentary by Courbet to the viewer that his great uncle's funeral was an important moment to him personally. So not super deep. That one's not as deep. And of course, this particular image can fall under the category as art for self-expression as well, being seen as the artist is expressing his emotions in relation to his uncle's passing. Because remember, things can be under more than one category. Here's a more contemporary example of art as commentary. And it is in the form of graffiti art. Does anyone here know what graffiti is? If you do, can you unmute and tell the rest of us? No one knows what graffiti is?
Isn't it essentially just like street art or
Yeah.
like the use of spray paint?
Yes, so it's commonly referred to as street art, and it's typically done with spray paint and cans of spray paint. Normally, it's illegal. Sometimes artists are commissioned to do it. Most of the time, they're not asked to do it, they just do it. So a lot of graffiti art does fall under this category of commentary. A lot of it also falls under self-expression, and we're going to look at one of those later. But this particular graffiti art is commentary on the federal bank. So here's the image right here. Just looking at it, you can see that the artist is not pleased with the Federal Reserve Bank in 2011. Most of you were not alive. Well, you were alive, but you're too little to remember. In 2008, there was a really bad economy crash that resulted in a lot of people having their homes foreclosed. And a lot of other really, really bad stuff happened in 2008. And we were still feeling the after effects of that here until 2011. So people were not pleased with the bank. And this unknown artist was very much so not pleased with the bank. And you can see that there with all of the imagery in that image. So you see the bank is destroying homes, basically destroying the planet. See the Monopoly man down here. The Monopoly man is never a good thing. Monopolies themselves are not a good thing. So he's also making a statement that the Federal Reserve Bank is a monopoly, which is technically illegal according to our government. So not pleased. He's conveying to the viewer that he is not happy with the state of the economy in 2011. Next, we're going to move on to art and worship. The first half of art and worship is pretty easy to understand because it primarily focuses on Western religion being Christianity. However, the second half of these examples for art and worship or art and religion are all Eastern religions, except for one Eskimo religion. Eastern religions are a lot harder for us to grasp, so we might end up spending some more time talking about those just because it's harder for us to understand the ritual and significance of those images. So just don't be surprised when I speed through the Western religion ones. So our first example of art and religion is a stained glass window. Stained glass windows were invented in the medieval era, also known as the Dark Ages, also known as the Gothic era. So during this particular time period, architecture of churches changed. Prior to the Gothic era, churches didn't really have windows. They were solid concrete stone buildings in the shape of a cross. But in the Gothic era, they decided that they wanted to make the buildings taller to reach to the heavens, and they wanted to let light in because light symbolized good, light was heaven. In order to do so, they invented stained glass windows to let in heaven's light into the churches. So that is just why stained glass windows are normally associated with churches. You'll see them in other buildings too, of course, but their primary original function was for a church. That's why they fall under this particular category. And oftentimes in stained glass windows, specifically ones in churches, you'll see stories from the Bible or saints, images of saints in the panels. Another example of Western art in worship is Michelangelo's Pietà. Pietà means pity. So if we look at the image, we see Mother Mary holding the limp body of Christ right after he was pulled down from the cross. This particular image is trying to evoke pity from the viewer. specifically pity from the viewer so that they would feel more tempted to open their purses up and donate more money to the church, because that's what was happening during the Renaissance era. The church was trying to get as much money as possible using religious stories and images and art. Michelangelo got roped into making quite a few religious art pieces during the Renaissance period. As another example of that is the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo himself actually hated painting. He just wanted to sculpt and that was it, but he kept being forced to paint stuff by the Pope at the time. And this is just another example of that. In the Sistine Chapel, on the ceiling, you will see a bunch of Old Testament stories and people from the Old Testament. Along the walls are little snippets of stories from the New Testament. And then right behind the pulpit here, you see what's called the Last Judgment. It was done at the end of the Renaissance period, and it's all from the book of Revelations. Because the Last Judgment scene was done at the end of the Renaissance and the rest of these were done closer to the beginning, the Last Judgment does have a different style to it, which we'll look at when we get to the Renaissance section, because it's kind of interesting to see the change. But yeah, just another example of art in religion or art in worship. Now we're going to move on to the Eastern side of things. So we're going to look at several examples throughout this course of Eastern religion and the art that is used in worship. We're going to be looking at something called a Shinto shrine later on, which is literally a shrine that's built for the Shinto religion, which is all based around worshiping nature. In a second, we're going to look at a Zen garden. Zen garden are part of the Buddhist religion. Buddhism is very much centered around the idea of reaching Zen or an extreme peace. We're also going to look at a mask used by the Eskimos a very long time ago to interpret their spirit world. So all of these are examples of art that exists in different religions that we're not quite familiar with over here in the Western world. Here's our mask. And now we're going to move on to some contemporary or more contemporary examples of art in worship and ritual. And these two examples are a little bit harder to grasp because once again, they're part of the Buddhist religion, which a lot of us over here on this side of the world aren't super familiar with. This is a work by Zhang Huan. The work is entitled Seeds, and it's made using incense ash, charcoal, and resin on canvas. So basically there's a canvas. The resin is used as the binder or the glue to stick the incense ash and charcoal to the canvas. Is anyone in here familiar with the importance of incense in Buddhism? No, I'm not surprised, because I didn't know until I was a lot older and more well-read. So in Buddhism, oftentimes when you are praying, you will light sticks of incense, and the incense helps carry your prayers to the heavens. So the ash itself contains the prayers. Normally, when there's a multitude of ash built up in these shrines, they will just throw the excess away. However, Zhang Huang decided to repurpose that ash to make his artwork. So I'm going to call on someone in a second, and hopefully they can help explain to us why this would be considered art in worship and ritual, specifically in reference to the incense ash. Livette, do you know why maybe this would be considered art in worship?
The smoke is basically, I don't know how to explain it. It's showing you that, so it's taking the ashes from the incense used to carry the prayers to heaven. It's putting it on a canvas.
Yes, that is exactly it. Awesome. Thank you, Livette. So instead of throwing those prayers away, we're repurposing them and letting them live on in the form of this artwork. Also, the seeds of the prayers get to live on and grow, which is kind of why it's titled that too. So good job. Awesome, Livette. You're the first person ever in all my years teaching that to get that. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So here's another example of Zhang Huan repurposing incense ash. This is just in a sculpture format. However, unlike the last one where they were stuck to the canvas and they will live on forever on that canvas, in this image or this sculpture, they are not stuck together, and ash is basically dust, so it will blow away. This used to be an entire Buddha's head, but because things deteriorate, things don't, ash blows away. So it's no longer in existence, is what I'm getting around to. So these prayers were repurposed to make a statue of Buddha, and over time, the prayers have blown away with the wind. So once again, another example of art in worship. Now we're going to move on to this particular chalice. This chalice is an example of Muslim artwork. In Muslim religion, it is not allowed for you to portray images of people or icons. It's considered idolatry, so a sin. So instead of, like in Western Christianity, we portray a lot of religious figures, in Muslim religion, they put a lot of their time and effort into doing things like metal work and mosaics, and a lot of calligraphy. This particular chalice and a lot of Muslim artwork is created for use in a religious setting. So this would have been used in their temple. We'll also look at some examples of Muslim architecture later on in this course. The architecture is strictly designed for praying areas or for religious training centers and things like that. Moving on to art for commemoration. Art for commemoration is art done in remembrance of an important event or in remembrance of a person or honoring a person. So basically signifying the importance of human life or in the importance of an event. And the very first day of class, I showed you a picture of the Taj Mahal, and a lot of you said it was for religion, which I'm not surprised. It looks like a religious building. but it is actually made in commemoration of Shah Jahan's favorite wife, meaning, yes, he had multiple wives. That was considered okay then in their religion. So his favorite wife ended up giving him a lot of kids, which was why she was his favorite, and she ended up dying in childbirth. So when she died, he was so distraught and he loved her so much that he wanted to create something to become a symbol of his love and adoration for her. So he made her the Taj Mahal and buried her in it. The Taj Mahal itself is supposed to represent paradise. So in front here in this image, you see a garden with a little pond in front of it. It's supposed to represent the gardens in paradise. And all of the Taj Mahal is built using extremely expensive materials, precious metals, stones, marbles. You'll see rubies and emeralds and stuff in the interior sections of the walls. A lot of filigree, a lot of gold. If you go to the Taj Mahal webpage, it'll tell you how much it would be estimated to be worth today. I think it's in the billions now, that the Taj Mahal's materials, just the materials itself, would be worth billions. So that's just to commemorate the love that he had for this woman. And I think he's actually buried next to her in it, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm pretty sure he's buried right next to her. Another example of art for commemoration is this image right here. This is the total opposite of someone making something for love. This is someone making art to remember or honor someone important, specifically the death of General Wolfe. So General Wolfe was an important figure in the French and Indian War, and he ended up dying in that war. I know a lot of you know about the French and Indian War, so I'm actually going to ask you guys if you can tell me who was fighting who in the French and Indian War. Anyone? Who knows who fought who in the French and Indian War?
The Indians fought the French.
No, that is a common mistake.
Wasn't it the English and the French, and then they both had Indians on each of their sides?
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually the British versus the French. There were Indians on each side, and the British colonists were forced to fight on the British side. But this particular painting has to do with the very last battle in the French and Indian War that occurred in Quebec, Canada. So the Battle of Quebec ends the French and Indian War. General Wolfe was one of the British leaders in that battle. General Wolfe worked closely with some of the colonists and the Native Americans that were familiar with the terrain. And they told him about a secret trail that went around the city. And they used that secret trail to completely surround the French troops and overwhelm them and basically win the war. Like I mentioned, Wolfe ends up dying in the battle. And right here we have an image. Obviously, this is not realistic because normally when you're fighting for your lives, you don't stop to watch your buddy die and all look at him in awe and wonder. That's not normal. This is a poetic version of General Wolfe's death. Probably no one was even there when he died. But right here, we have General Wolfe in the center. It's pretty easy to see him because just like with Goya's painting, the light is more focused on him. Everyone's eyes go towards him, meaning all of the lines in the painting go towards him. Also, he is slightly more white cast than everyone else. So he's the central figure. Right here, you see his buddy trying to stop the wound up. Everybody's watching him. Over here, you have a colonist in green just to remind people that the British colonists were helping out and right below him, you have the Indian, just to remind people that there were also Native Americans on the British side during the war. Fun fact is that a majority of the work created post-Renaissance period, you're going to see triangular groupings of figures, because during the Renaissance period, I think it was Leonardo da Vinci, it was one of those guys, that decided triangular groupings of people were more aesthetically pleasing. So yeah, and you'll see that in his Last Supper if you look at Da Vinci's Last Supper. Anyways, that was just a side note. So this is just all about commemorating the death of a war hero. It's a long story just to say that. The next one is a more recent version of commemorating war heroes, and that is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial by Maya Lin. Normally in US history, when there is a war fought, we do make memorials. However, normally those memorials show people in very heroic stances mid-battle, looking strong and courageous. Maya Lin's war memorial is quite the opposite of that. If you ever look at the raising of the flag in Iwo Jima from World War II, that's the World War II war memorial. It's extremely heroic. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is extremely somber and solemn. You don't see images of strong people. You don't see people mid-battle fighting their way tooth and nail. You see large black granite walls listing the 60,000 names of Americans who died and went missing during that war. On that wall with the names, the stone is extremely polished, so you will see your own reflection in those names to remind you of why those people died. So like I said, extremely somber. The work itself is cut into the earth. It's supposed to represent a gash in the land or a wound in the land. Just to hit home that this war was not a popular war. People did not support the Vietnam War. It was one of the few wars in US history that we've lost. So it's not a happy moment. It's a somber moment. Has anyone seen this in person?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. What do you think?
It was beautiful to see. We got to see it at night, and so they had little lights shining up on the granite,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it was very somber.
Yeah. It's not like the other war memorials surrounding it. It's definitely different. And it's definitely more contemporary. Maya Lin actually did this when she was in college. She came up with this design when she was in college. They're kind of impressive. She was pretty young. Moving on to art as persuasion. Art as persuasion is art that's trying to influence the viewer's opinion or make them think a particular thing. Most commonly, we see art as persuasion today in the forms of advertisements. So commercials, ads on Instagram, Facebook, trying to get us to buy stuff. Those are all forms of art as persuasion. However, this particular art form has existed for centuries. For example, we see it in Augusta of Prima Porta. Here is the image right there. Does anyone know what Emperor Augustus was the emperor of?
The Roman Empire.
Yay, yes. Yes, very good. Yes, he was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And this right here is a statue that he had made of himself during his reign. And you might not think this is art for persuasion right away, but it is very similar to advertisements that we see about presidents today. So whenever there's an election coming up, we see a lot of ads saying so-and-so is the best. Here are all the reasons why. That's pretty much the same thing this statue is doing. So right here, we see Emperor Augustus wearing armor. That's to signify the fact that he is capable of winning battles and fighting for you. And he's a good military leader and strong. He has an authoritative figure and stance with his finger up. That's to signify that he is a leader, he is a rule maker, and he will lead you justly. And he is a commander. And then the odd thing about this that no one ever quite catches is the little baby with wings. That refers to a little baby with wings in Greek mythology or Roman mythology called Cupid. This is the strangest part of this statue. Emperor Augustus claims and claimed back then that he was a descendant of Cupid. Does anyone in here know who Cupid was the son of?
Venus.
Yeah, so Venus or Aphrodite. Yes, both. They're the same thing. It just depends on which name you want to go with. So the goddess Venus was the mother of Cupid, and Venus is the daughter of Zeus, who's like the head honcho of the gods and goddesses. So basically, Emperor Augustus right here is claiming that he is a god. He is a military leader, he is smart, he is strong, he is a commander, and he's basically a god. So he's the best. You can't be better than him. So yeah, it's really similar to a lot of presidential campaigns that we see on TV, just a little stranger. So he's trying to persuade his audience to think that he is the best. We also see that happen with Louis XIV. Louis XIV created a new palace in France for the government to exist in. That palace was the Palace of Versailles. He moved the head of government from Paris to Versailles for his palace. If you know anything about the Palace of Versailles, you know that it is extremely large. There's a lot of gold from like the ceilings to the floors in that place. It's very opulent and expensive. That is to persuade his people and any visiting dignitaries to think that he is strong and wealthy. He is strong enough to just have the entire government moved to a new palace and wealthy enough to build the largest, most opulent palace seen in Europe at that date. And we're going to skip our little charioteer and go on to The Effects of Good Government by Ambrogio Lorenzetti. So during the Renaissance era in Italy, Ambrogio Lorenzetti was commissioned to create a fresco. A fresco is just a painting on a wall of the effects of good government and the effects of bad government. These wall paintings or frescoes were done in the basically city hall is what it was, the building of governance in that particular Italian city of Florence, where all of the laws and rules were made. On one side of the room, you had this image, which showed all of the effects of good government. So you see a highly functioning society. If we could see a better image that's not deteriorated over time, you would see that they're all wealthy, well-dressed, well-fed, well taken care of. And then directly opposite this wall, you would see a fresco of the effects of bad government. And in that image, you see people being raped, murdered, killed, houses on fire, everything's a disaster. These two images were created by Lorenzetti and commissioned by that government so that when people walked into this city hall building, You would see on one side the examples of good government, on one side the examples of bad government, and you would see, oh, Florence isn't on fire, so we must be a good government. It's trying to persuade the people to think that Florence's government is great and that there's nothing wrong with it. We're going to keep that one too. And move on to a more contemporary version. Our contemporary example is similar to those advertisements like I mentioned earlier. And it is a poster that shows how horrible and destructive global warming is to the earth. Of course, this is extremely exaggerated. It was really popular in the late 90s for this poster to be distributed. I'm old, so I remember seeing it. I'm going to skip that one and move on to the last one, which is art as self-expression. Art as self-expression is the one that we see probably most common today. A lot of abstract art falls under art as self-expression, and contemporary art in general usually falls under this. And if you remember, I've said several times that art can be under multiple categories. So there's several things that we've talked about today that could be under this category as well. But art as self-expression means there's not like a social issue as to why the artist is making this. Usually they're doing it just to express their own needs, thoughts, and desires, or expressing their talent to the world. So a great example of that is the self-portrait with Jewish identity card. This particular image right here was created during World War II, and it just shows the artist's anxiety during that time being a member of the Jewish faith. He was afraid and stressed out, so he was expressing that emotion in this painting. And then, like I mentioned, a lot of more abstract art falls under art as self-expression as well. We talked about Vasily Kandinsky yesterday. He was the artist that likes to listen to music and try and express these sounds visually. So this is another one of his compositions. This is composition 6. He listens to music and expresses it in images and colors. Okay, so that was really, really fast. Let me stop sharing for a second. That was us very, very quickly going through the 6 purposes and functions of art. Yesterday we went over what art is. Today we went over the different reasons why art's made. Just because I really, really want to hit this home, because a lot of times we forget it, art can be made for several reasons. It doesn't have to just be one. And I mentioned at the beginning of this session that I'm trying to get you guys caught up so that you have all of the information that you need to take your test or quiz tomorrow. Did Leslie ever show up? I don't see her. I'm trying to check attendance really fast too. No. Okay. All right, so I am going to go ahead and start the next section. The next section builds on this idea of the basic understandings of art. So first off, we did what is art. Now, today we focused on the purpose of making art. Now we're going to get into the artist's toolbox and the skills and tools and knowledge that they use to make their art. And we're going to be starting with the basic things like lines. So we're going really, really basic right now. So In this chapter, once again, we are going to be doing the visual elements. So the tips and tricks that artists use to create their artwork. And hopefully by the end of this particular section, which we will finish tomorrow, you guys will be able to analyze those visual elements and understand why artists use them, how they use them correctly to convey their purposes and functions the way that they want to. They use these tools to create visual effects and illusionistic effects. So trying to create a 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional plane, and try and create volume. They also use color and the study of color. Artists are very well versed in the study of color and understanding what colors work well together and what colors don't. Like we went over the red and green, well, the red chessboard with the green lines, those are complementary colors, meaning that artists chose those colors for that specific reason because they go well together. Artists understand those things. So we're going to be looking at all of those tips and tricks today. Here's some basic vocabulary, and I'm going to stay on this slide for a little while if you're taking notes. The first term is analogous colors. Analogous colors are colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel like they're touching each other. Analogous colors go really well together. So an example of that would be purple and blue. They're touching each other on the color wheel. They are analogous colors. They go together really well. Complementary colors are colors or hues that are directly opposite from each other, like red and green. Complementary colors also go really well together. And of course, as we go through this session, we'll be going over examples of all of these things as well. A value is the light or darkness of a surface. Remember, in art, we generally don't consider white and black a color or colors. Those are values. Linear perspective, we looked at when we were looking at the death of General Wolfe and Francisco Goya's 3rd of May. That's the use of lines to try and direct the viewer's eyes, as well as the use of lines to try and make something look more 3-dimensional versus 2-dimensional. And then another way that you can make something look more 3-dimensional is atmospheric perspective. We'll see that mostly in landscape paintings, and that's using a thick, foggy haze the further back you go to make things look like they're far away. And then I mentioned chiaroscuro already today. Chiaroscuro is an Italian word that means light and dark. And it's the strong use of lights and darks to try and add some more dimension and depth, and a lot of times more drama to a painting.
Miss McBride, I have a question. Do you know when the bookstore opens?
I have no idea.
Okay, because we were wondering to go get the Prebbles art forms.
Mm-hmm.
The bookstore?
Yeah, I think it says on the website, the Midland College website, but I'm not sure. Does anyone else know?
Yeah, I think 8 to 4.
Okay. I'm guessing
Thank
probably
you.
8 to 4. It makes sense because that's our normal work hours here is 8 to 4.
Well, thank you.
Like surely one of us will know in here. Okay, so we're going to move on to all of the tools that we're going to be studying in this section. Oh, I forgot about this slide. Oops. Okay, so in case you haven't caught on, a two-dimensional surface is something that's flat, such as paper. You can draw on paper, but it's still flat. Three-dimensional space is something that you can usually see all the sides of, such as a sculpture, and it's not confined to a flat surface. But I'm guessing most of you probably know that. Okay, moving on to our tools that we're going to study. We have lines that we're going to be looking at for this section, and the way that you can use different lines to make shapes. We're also going to be looking at mass. So there's different ways that you can make mass appear. You can make mass appear by using certain colors, and you can make mass appear using lines. You can also use certain techniques and tricks using lines and shapes and mass to define space and make things look like there is a background, even if there doesn't really look like there is one originally, especially on a two-dimensional surface, because it's really hard to make a full background on a flat space. So you have to use lines and shapes to do that. We're also going to be looking at the passage of time in artwork for this section. The easiest way to understand the passage of time is seen in films, because those are a little bit more linear for us to understand, but it can be seen on two-dimensional planes as well. We're also going to be looking at motion. A lot of times for sculptures and images, it's going to be implied motion, so things will look like they're running, but they aren't actually running. We're also going to be looking at the use of lights and darks, the use of color, and the use of texture in artworks. Those are the different tools that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to see all of those tools in this particular image, which is the last image that we're going to look at today. So this is Daniel Richter's OOA2. On this image, we see a use of a lot of different lines. We see the use of lines in paint drips, the use of lines in ending and changing colors, the use of lines to create a figure, the use of lines to create shapes. We also see blacks and whites used to create masses, and different colors used, and colors and lines used to create a background space. So right here we see the green and then a blue line continuing over here that allows us to understand that there's a background. We also see that he's running on ground right here. That is also a form of implied motion, him running from one side of the panel to another. He's not actually running because he's not a real thing, but he's implied to be running. The artist uses a lot of patches of light and darks to help create that depth, and bold colors are used in this image to capture the viewer's attention, and different kinds of textures as well. So you see the soft, hazier textures in the backgrounds, and then you see the solid mass, which is a stiffer texture, and then the paint drips in the foregrounds are a thicker, more impasto texture. And tomorrow we are going to start off by discussing all of the different kinds of lines that artists use and how they use them. So basically this particular section is us looking and analyzing lines, shapes, mass, space, time, motion, light, color, and texture, and looking at the different examples of how different artists put their spin on those particular techniques. Now, I'm going to stop there for today. I know it was a lot of me talking. Like I said, it was a lot of talking today. Because I want to get done and give you all of your stuff that you need for the quiz. So I'm apologizing now for that. And hopefully next week we aren't as rushed. So, are there any